The Chinese Communist Party is emboldened when it thinks that the international community is either not paying attention or is not willing to do anything about it. And when they're emboldened, they then continue and get worse until it then becomes a much more serious issue that the West has to, and the international community has to grapple with.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Benedict Rogers talks about religious freedom in communist China. He says Christians are experiencing the worst persecution since the Cultural Revolution.
The Communist Party is in the process of producing a new translation of the Bible, sort of on its terms, and it will be very interesting to see how they change the Bible to suit the communist narrative.
And talks about CCP schemes to completely destroy the culture of Uyghurs and Tibetans.
This Sinicization, so the eradication of Tibetan culture and language, the moving in large numbers of Tibetan Buddhist children into Chinese boarding schools where they're forced to speak Mandarin, abandon their Buddhist and Tibetan religious and cultural heritage, and essentially become Han Chinese. So it's a real attempt to dilute and even destroy Tibetan identity.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with author and China expert Benedict Rogers. Benedict, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You were the first guest on British Thought Leaders 2 years ago, so welcome back.
Thank you.
Since then you released the China Nexus, which is a fascinating account of your 30 years kind of in and around China human rights. And what did you hope to achieve with this book?
I think what I really hoped to achieve was to show the breadth and depth of repression in China today across so many fronts, whether it's the persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of Christians, the genocide of the Uyghurs, Tibet, the dismantling of freedom in Hong Kong, and the crackdown on dissent in China more generally. And when I was thinking about the book, I realized that although there are many excellent books on China, most of the books that exist cover sort of one particular dimension of China, whether it's sort of modern history or the economy or the Communist Party's structure. And I realized I couldn't think of a book that really put all the pieces of the human rights picture together in one volume, and also looks at the threats to Taiwan, the relationship between Beijing and two other dictatorships in the region, Myanmar and North Korea, and also the question of what the international community should do about the challenge of China. And so when I thought about all these things and I realized I couldn't think of a book that did that, I thought, well, that's the book I should write.
Yeah. Before we dive into those issues, I just wanted to ask you, why is the Chinese regime so against people having religious freedom? I mean, what is the problem?
I think essentially there are two factors. The first is that the Chinese regime is still, whether it's communist in practice is another question, but it is the Communist Party, and communism is inherently atheist and anti-religion. So ideologically it comes from that starting point. But I think also the Chinese Communist Party is incredibly nervous about any gathering of people in large numbers around an idea that is different from the Communist Party's idea, and that's why they don't like religion, particularly when it involves large numbers of people.
So China Aid founder Bob Fu said that Chinese Christians are experiencing the worst persecution since the Cultural Revolution. I mean, could you flesh that out for us? What's happening with Christians in China?
Yes, well, I very much agree with Bob Fu. The Chinese Communist Party, over the decades since 1949, it's always been anti-religion, but its approach has varied. During the Cultural Revolution, it really tried to eradicate Christianity completely, and it ended up driving it totally underground. During the opening up era under Deng Xiaoping and his successors, there was a little bit of relaxation, by no means religious freedom, but there was just an easing off of the persecution to a certain extent. And what tended to happen in those years was that the approach and the policy was very much dependent on the provincial or municipal authorities. So it was decided at a local level, and it varied throughout the country. So there were certain regions where actually Christians had a bit more space, and other regions where it was more harsh. What's happened in the last decade under Xi Jinping is that policy seems to have been brought to the centre, and the approach is nationwide, and it's consistently far harsher than it was. And so we've seen crackdown on unregistered churches that are outside the state-controlled structures, but also even within the state-approved churches, a real propaganda effort to Xi Jinping has what he calls a campaign of Sinicization of religion, but that doesn't mean cultural Sinicization. It basically means the political indoctrination of religion. So that means forcing churches to display pictures of Xi Jinping, propaganda banners from the Communist Party alongside religious imagery. The Communist Party is in the process of producing a new translation of the Bible, sort of on its terms, and it will be very interesting to see how they change the Bible to suit the communist narrative. And we've also seen over recent years the destruction of thousands of churches and crosses, the prohibition on young people under the age of 18 from going to places of worship, and just a real crackdown on Christianity across the nation.
So this idea of registered churches is quite unusual to us in the West. So there's kind of an official Christianity that's backed by the Communist Party, is that right?
That's right. So the approach that the Communist Party has taken for some decades is, if they can't eliminate Christianity, they want to at least control it. And so they have these structures, both for Protestant and for Catholic churches, that are state-controlled and therefore, very restricted in what they can say and do. And millions of Christians reject that. They don't want to be part of a state-controlled structure, and so they worship in unregistered, sometimes known as house churches, but many of them are not really house churches because they're huge gatherings, but they are unregistered and therefore illegal.
You talk about Tibet as well in your book. You say it's one of the most oppressed corners of the world. Could you elaborate a bit on that for us?
Yes, I think if you want to understand the Chinese Communist Party's repression, one should always look at Tibet, because Tibet is the region under Chinese control that has suffered probably most for longest, invaded in the 1950s and occupied ever since then. And the occupation has just been appallingly brutal, and it seems to have intensified in the last decade. So we've seen Tibetan Buddhist monks arrested and jailed, Buddhist monasteries under strict surveillance and control, and particularly this Sinicization, so the eradication of Tibetan culture and language, the moving in large numbers of Tibetan Buddhist children into Chinese boarding schools where they're forced to speak Mandarin, abandon their Buddhist and Tibetan religious and cultural heritage, and essentially become Han Chinese. So it's a real attempt to dilute and even destroy Tibetan identity.
You've got a quote in there from a former bank employee who fled Tibet, who says the Chinese regime's key policy aim is to turn the Tibetans into Chinese. It's almost like a plan to wipe out this whole culture by replacing people.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Alongside the policies of moving Tibetan children into Chinese boarding schools, there's also been a policy of changing the demographics by encouraging large numbers of Han Chinese to settle in the Tibetan region.
There's a similar thing happening with the Uyghurs in Shinjang.
Yes, absolutely. The Shinjang region has definitely changed in its demographics, and alongside the incredibly shocking, brutal physical persecution of the Uyghurs, moving large numbers into effectively concentration camps, the religious persecution, there has also been this policy of trying to change the demographics in the region.
There's one thing in your book that I found quite terrifying. It was called Becoming Family, a CCP project. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, this is a really unbelievable policy of forcing Uyghur families to accept, against their will, completely no choice, accept a Chinese government agent to live in their home for a period of time. And so these Chinese agents move into people's homes. Obviously, that means the family is under 24-hour observation by the party, and it's an attempt again to repress, restrict, and threaten the Uyghur population.
So if you made a movie with that as the plot line, people would say, no, that's gone too far. It's bizarre.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine the equivalent of, in our country, a stranger turns up on your doorstep and says, well, I'm moving in now for 6 months, and you have no idea who they are, you don't know anything about them, but you're forced to give them a bed and take them into your home. And it's a totally bizarre policy.
It seems the CCP has really been pushing forward technology to persecute the Uyghurs in particular. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this has happened particularly in both Tibet and Xinjiang, where I would say those two regions have been kind of the laboratory for the rollout of an Orwellian surveillance state, turning, in the case of Xinjiang, the region into a place where there are artificial intelligence, facial recognition cameras pretty much on every street corner, checkpoints, monitoring mobile phones. Any searches on the internet are immediately picked up, and if it's a search for something that the party doesn't like, that can lead the individual to being in serious trouble. So it really is Orwellian, the use of technology to monitor everyone's activities.
You also talk about the persecution against Falun Gong. So this has been going on for 25 years now, and it's quite a large scale. There's 100 million people thought to be practicing by 1999. Why do you think the West is relatively silent on this issue?
Yes, you're right that the West has not spoken up enough on this issue by comparison with some of the other issues. I think perhaps there was, for a period of time, and I think it's beginning to change now, but for a period of time there was a reluctance to believe the kind of things that were alleged. The idea of forced organ harvesting, for example, of taking organs from prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong practitioners, was very hard to believe because it's so shocking, and it was also very hard to prove because, by definition, the victim is dead, the perpetrators are the medical staff and the police and other people from the authorities who carry out the act, and the evidence is swept away. And so initially all we had to go on was witness testimony, so it was hard to prove. I think there was a turning point when the British barrister Sir Geoffrey Nice, who I know has been on your series as well, and of course was the prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic, when he was persuaded, and I had a small part in helping to persuade him to look at this question, and he set up an independent tribunal to do this. And I think the credibility of that tribunal was enormously helpful because it was made up of international experts, legal, medical, and other experts, who had no previous agenda with China, no connections to Falun Gong. They couldn't be dismissed as simply either anti-China or Falun Gong sort of propaganda people. They were genuinely independent and coming to the question fresh. And they looked at the evidence. They had many hours of hearings, and they concluded beyond reasonable doubt that this was happening, and they published a very detailed and damning report. I remember one of the lines in the report was that this is a crime against humanity, and that anyone dealing with the Chinese state needs to be aware that they're dealing with a criminal state. And I think as a result of that report, people in politics, in the media, in public life, are starting to take this issue more seriously. I know in the last year or two, at some of the key anniversaries of the persecution of Falun Gong, prominent politicians have issued statements of support in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have done a few years ago. I also think Falun Gong is becoming better known and better understood. Perhaps in the past there was a lack of understanding. There was also extensive propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party, total lies and misinformation about what Falun Gong is. And I think now people have woken up to the fact that what the Chinese state says about Falun Gong is not true, and people have a better understanding of Falun Gong, and so that helps.
Do you think if back in 1999, when the CCP started this massive persecution against probably 1 in 12 Chinese people, if the West had kind of stood up at that time and tried to stop it a bit more, things would have been easier later on for Xinjiang, Hong Kong, etc.?
Yes, definitely. I think with all of these issues, and particularly with the persecution of Falun Gong from 1999, I think if the West had spoken up much more robustly at a much earlier point, they could have prevented things worsening. And I think the Chinese Communist Party is emboldened when it thinks that the international community is either not paying attention or is not willing to do anything about it. And when they're emboldened, they then continue and get worse until it then becomes a much more serious issue that the West has to, and the international community has to grapple with.
You mentioned in the intro dissent in mainland China on the whole. And what's the situation like in that regard?
Well, it's also very serious. I remember I used to go to China a lot through the 1990s and first decade of the 2000s. And during those years, I would say that there was a certain level of relaxation. It was never freedom, of course, and there were always serious human rights violations and repression of dissidents. But there was a period during those 2 decades where there was certain space for civil society. I met Chinese human rights lawyers who were able to defend human rights cases, again, within certain red lines, but they could do something. I met civil society groups, bloggers, journalists, who were all able to operate within that space. And as I say, it wasn't freedom, and if they crossed red lines, they would be arrested and jailed. But within a certain space, they had some level of movement. And I would say over the last decade under Xi Jinping, pretty much all of that space has disappeared. It's now incredibly dangerous for not just active dissidents or lawyers, many of whom have been arrested and disappeared, but also just for ordinary people who might be, for example, whistleblowers. We saw that over COVID with some of the doctors who tried to call attention in the early months to this new virus, and instead of being taken seriously, they were arrested and threatened and warned. The citizen journalist Zhang is a key example of that. She went to Wuhan to make a film about this new virus, and she's been in prison since then. So really the space that had existed a decade or two ago for anyone to say anything critical of the party has gone.
What's the situation in Hong Kong now? Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Well, Hong Kong has changed with extraordinary speed from being one of Asia's freest and most open cities to being one of its most repressive police states. It, of course, was handed over to China in 1997 with the promise of one country, two systems, and at least 50 years of respect for Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy and the rule of law. And I would say for the first, perhaps, decade after the handover, China, by and large, kept to that promise, at least on the surface. And I lived there for the first 5 years after the handover, and definitely during those years there was freedom in Hong Kong, and I worked as a journalist, and I could publish articles then that would never see the light of day today and would probably land me in jail if I was in Hong Kong today. What's happened in the last decade or so since the umbrella movement of 2014, but particularly intensely the last 5 years since the 2019 protests and then the introduction of the very draconian national security law, and subsequently this year a further security law. The result of that has been the total dismantling of all of Hong Kong's freedoms. There's pretty much no longer any free independent media. Most of civil society, certainly civil society organizations that are in any way politically oriented, probably civil society organizations that are on social issues like poverty or homelessness, the disabled, they're probably okay. But any civil society groups that have any political orientation have been shut down, including some trade unions. Most of the pro-democracy leaders are either in prison or in exile. And Hong Kong has now thousands of well, certainly hundreds of political prisoners. People like Jimmy Lai, who has been in prison since December 2020. He's 76 years old, the founder of the Apple Daily newspaper, British citizen,
yeah.
Exactly. And he's, although he's been in prison for 3.5 years, he still is undergoing his trial under the national security law, which could well result in him spending the rest of his years in jail. So Hong Kong is a very different place from the Hong Kong that I knew. And of course, I can't go to Hong Kong now. I was denied entry in 2017. I was actually threatened with a prison sentence in 2022 because of the work I do here. So even outside Hong Kong, the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities, because the national security law has this extraterritorial application, the long arm of Beijing reaches, well beyond Hong Kong.
Would you say religious freedom is pretty much the same as mainland China now for Hong Kong?
I would say it's certainly increasingly threatened. It's probably a few degrees less severe at the moment than it is in mainland China, in the sense that you can still go to a church or a mosque or a temple in Hong Kong relatively freely for a Sunday service in the case of a church, for example. But what is restricted now, because of the climate of fear in Hong Kong, is what religious leaders will say in their sermons. So a high degree of self-censorship. Christian priests and pastors in the past would have spoken out quite openly in their sermons on issues of human rights and democracy, and now almost all of them will be very careful to avoid any politically sensitive topics. The education sector is also affected because something like 60% of Hong Kong schools are church-run or run by faith-based organizations. And actually Hong Kong Watch produced a report last year on the threats to religious freedom, looking at all the issues I've just described. So I would say freedom of religion in Hong Kong is certainly under increasing threat. I think in a way that's inevitable. When freedom itself is dismantled, freedom of religion is automatically going to be affected. But it's not quite yet on the same scale of severity as in mainland China. There isn't the physical destruction of places of worship, but there's a more insidious surveillance and self-censorship.
The former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently said, in response to a question from you, that his biggest failing in office was that he didn't secure the freedoms of Hong Kong. I mean, would you agree this sentiment that the Western governments didn't do enough, or do you think it was just inevitable?
No, I would definitely agree with that. I think that, again, it comes back to this point of not speaking out early on enough. I think that when I look back to the 2014 umbrella movement protests, the British government and other governments were remarkably quiet and weak in their interventions on that situation. And I think if they'd been more robust then, it might have prevented things deteriorating as significantly and rapidly as they have. And even when things really started to deteriorate, and it was clear that they were deteriorating from 2019 onwards, I mean, the US was the only country that imposed any kind of sanctions, and I think, as Mike Pompeo said, they could have done more. They did a lot more than other countries, and I give them credit for that, but they could have done more. But certainly the UK, the EU, Canada, Australia could all have joined the US in imposing sanctions, and that might have had an effect early on to prevent things worsening.
If we look at when David Cameron was Prime Minister, there wasn't too much criticism of the Chinese regime, but since then quite a few big things have happened. Obviously COVID, parliamentarians being sanctioned, Interparliamentary Alliance on China was founded, the tribunals that you mentioned. Do you think our establishment is a lot more kind of on the right track with its view of the CCP now?
It's certainly on a much better track than it was during the so-called golden era. I remember during the golden era, there were a number of things that I was involved with, particularly through the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, where the then Conservative Party leadership in government were really unhappy with us speaking out. We did an inquiry in 2016 and produced a report. And we know that the government at the time were really furious with us for doing so. When Xi Jinping visited on his state visit in 2015, an MP, Fiona Bruce, who at the time was the chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, she went on to be the Prime Minister's envoy on freedom of religion. She asked an urgent question about human rights in China during the course of Xi Jinping's state visit, and again, the government at the time were furious with her because they saw it as derailing their efforts to improve relations with China. So at that time, it was very hard to get the government to say anything on human rights or to take our concerns seriously. And that has changed a lot. I mean, now government ministers, the Foreign Office, key politicians in all parties are much more outspoken. I think in policy terms, there's still a long way to go. If I think on Hong Kong, for example, the one policy I would give the previous government real credit for was the introduction of the British National Overseas Scheme to give hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers the lifeline out of Hong Kong to build a new life in freedom in the UK. And that was very welcome. But apart from that, there's relatively few policy achievements that I can point to that really show the government standing up to China. And I think there's more work that needs to be done on that front. Imposing sanctions. There were a few token sanctions in response to the Shinjang, the genocide of the Uyghurs, but they were fairly token. They were fairly targeted at mid-level entities rather than the real perpetrators. So there's more work to be done, but definitely it's a different atmosphere than it was under the golden era.
And it's quite a cross-party change in atmosphere as well, would you say? Yeah.
Definitely. There've been key voices in all political parties, and it will be very interesting to see what the new Labour government does. I know they're carrying out an audit of China policy across Whitehall, which is something actually I recommended a few years ago, and so I welcome the fact that they are reviewing China policy across government departments. I hope that won't be used as a smokescreen or an excuse for sort of delaying decisive action. And I hope it will be a transparent and inclusive review process where the government will hear from important voices in the diaspora communities, in the human rights sector. But it's nevertheless an important step. And I also welcome the fact that the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, at the NATO summit promised to be robust on human rights in China. Again, we'll have to see what being robust actually means in practice. But I hope the new government will take these issues very seriously.
I just wanted to finally ask you, in your book, you talk about your 30 years of human rights work, and there's so many excellent examples of you doing things to expose what the CCP has been doing. Have you experienced any threats to your own safety here in the UK?
I have, yes, quite regularly. For a period of time from about 2018 through to 2020 or 2021, I received a succession of anonymous threatening letters by post, stamped and postmarked from Hong Kong, to my home address. And obviously I don't advertise my home address, so whoever was sending them had gone to some lengths to find out my home address. They also sent some of these letters to some of my neighbours in the street where I live in London, which was a new way of getting to know my neighbours. And then my mother started receiving similar letters, and she lives in a totally different part of the country. So that was concerning how they managed to find her address. I've also had a series of attempts to impersonate me via email, fake email addresses being set up in my name, and then emails being sent to MPs and journalists supposedly from me. Of course, I mean, probably the least of all the threats is daily trolling on Twitter, but that's just a sort of fact of life.
Dissent army are always in your comments.
Exactly. And then I've had, as I mentioned, I had this letter from the Hong Kong police in 2022 telling me to stop what I'm doing, shut down Hong Kong Watch's activities within 72 hours of receipt of the letter. Otherwise, I could face a prison sentence in Hong Kong. I think all of these attempts are designed more to intimidate and scare me rather than actually representing an actual physical threat. I think, of course, I don't discount the possibility, but I think it's unlikely that I'm at serious physical risk, at least in London or in the UK. What I do have to be careful about is when I travel internationally, if I'm traveling to countries that have extradition agreements with Hong Kong or China, and if they're countries that might be persuaded to use those extradition agreements, I would need to take advice on whether or not I should go. Last year I travelled to Taiwan, and I had to sort of double check what would happen if the flight had to divert for weather conditions or technical reasons. Would it divert to Hong Kong or China? I was reassured that because I was flying on a Taiwanese airline, there was no danger of that. But these are the kind of things that I just have to sort of check. But the one thing I'm very determined about is that it's clear all these things are designed to intimidate me and make me stop doing what I'm doing. And therefore it's made me all the more determined not to do that, but to redouble my efforts.
Benedict Rogers, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.